This is the last NBA offseason as we've come to know it. There are some new rules getting put into place next year, and we're already going to see some teams this offseason make adjustments as they prepare for the new world of the NBA next year, and some really big potential problems that could be created by these new rules in free agency, as well as for the middle class of players in the NBA. Now, this problem that I'm going to talk about is something we've already kind of seen over the last few seasons as the league implemented the Supermax contract, which kind of went completely against what they wanted it to do. The initial point was to help teams retain their star players by being able to offer them more money if they make all NBA teams. But instead, it's kind of made it more difficult to retain those guys because they're so expensive and guys are reaching Supermax levels, even though maybe they shouldn't be earning those levels of contracts based off how good of players they are. And that has shrunk the amount of money left and available for some of these other free agents. So it's already kind of started this problem, but these new rules are going to expedite that problem. Now, these new rules come into play next off season, but we are going to see some teams cutting salary, making different moves, changing their rosters in a way that normally wouldn't make any sense until you add the context of these new rules that are getting put into place in a year. Now, these new rules come from the new CBA, and the goal of them, the aim of this was to limit these teams that are willing to continue to spend and spend and spend well above and beyond the luxury tax. The league wants to spread out the talent. They don't want the talent to be as centralized as it relates specifically to teams being willing to constantly spend. For example, the Golden State Warriors this most recent season, they were able to have Clay, Steph, Draymond, Wiggins, and Jordan Poole, all guys on significant contracts, putting them way above and beyond the luxury tax, way above into this completely different stratosphere of spending. The league is trying to spread out that level of talent and those level of contracts. Same thing with the pre-KD trade Nets, where they had Kyrie, they had KD, and then somehow they were also able to add James Harden because they didn't care how much they spent. They just wanted to build the best possible basketball team, and the league wants that to stop. And those two different groups, whether it be the Warriors with those 5 contracts or the former Nets with those 3 big contracts, those kinds of things are just not going to be possible under these new rules. Okay, so some quick nerdy salary cap stuff before we move on to the rest of the video so everybody understands we're all on the same page. The luxury tax was put into place in the NBA to prevent teams like this, like Golden State, like Brooklyn, from spending such large amounts. You have the salary cap, above that you have the luxury tax, and if you're up here, that means that you are going to have to spend more money even above what you're already spending at that point. For example, if you're spending $150 million in salary and you're above the luxury tax, whatever amount you are above the luxury tax, you're going to be taxed dollar for dollar, and then at a certain point, $2 per dollar tax to the rest of the teams in the league if you want to continue to spend and spend and spend, as Golden State and formerly Brooklyn did. But the new rule, the biggest thing here in terms of the new CBA is there is another level. You have cap, you have the luxury tax, then you have the second level of the luxury tax. The second apron is what it's being phrased as. It's a phrase you're going to hear a lot. And essentially what this means is if you hit this number up here, that means that there are penalties put in terms of how you're able to build your roster. Those include no mid-level exception. You can't trade picks 7 years out, first-round picks. You cannot sign buyout players, and you have to 100% salary match when you send out players in a trade. So if you send out players that equal $25 million in a trade, you can't take back 26. You got to take back 25 or less. And what essentially that means is that you have to pick and choose who your cornerstone players are and then fill out the rest of the roster with minimum salary guys if you get all the way up to this luxury tax threshold. Now, to kind of ground this conversation here a little bit so we're not just so into these little nitty-gritty salary cap details. For example, let's talk about Boston. They're going to be a team that everybody's going to be talking about this offseason in terms of what they want to do with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, right? Let's just say that they have next offseason Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, both of them on a Supermax contract, okay? Just between those two guys, you're above the salary cap. Like, that's basically where you're at. You have about $40 million left until you get to the first luxury tax. Then, for example, this year's team, you have Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, boom. You're at the luxury tax right there. You add Derek White, which is another, $17-18 million then above the luxury tax. Now you're at the second apron. At that point, you have those 5 players, Brown, Tatum, Smart, Brogdon, Derek White. You are at the second apron. The rest of the roster, in terms of guys you are adding and bringing in, have to be minimum salary players. Now, the reason that's a problem is because plenty of teams are going to find themselves in this situation where they're willing to go above the luxury tax to build a competent team because it's going to be that much of an advantage. And if you get to this point where you're able to just sign guys for minimum contracts and that's it, there's a lot of players around the league right now that make between $15-20 million that fill out some of those Marcus Smart, Derek White level salaries, and there's going to be less spots for those kinds of guys, which means generally we're going to see players that would not normally be signing minimum salary contracts that suddenly will be. And the reason for that is because there will be less teams with access to their mid-level exception, which is now in the double digits. The mid-level exception is a good contract. It's, 10, 11, $12 million a year, and maybe even above that moving forward over the next couple of seasons. And there's going to be less of those available, and those kinds of players are going to be suddenly falling into minimum salary contract positions. And why all of this matters, let's bring this full circle, is not necessarily like nobody's feeling bad about, middle-class NBA players going from making $15 million a year to something less than that. Nobody's feeling bad about that. That's not the point. The point is roster construction in the NBA is already, after in the Supermax era, so focused on stars. The stars level construction of a team is still by far the biggest priority on a roster, and that's only going to be increased by these new rules. Yes, there might be a little bit more talent spread out. Like Jordan Poole might be a Washington Wizard instead of a Golden State Warrior, right? Jaylen Brown might be in Houston while Boston tries to retool and use that money in a different way. And maybe that makes the league happy. Maybe that's what they want. But I think generally what you're going to end up having is something that used to happen all the time in like the 90s, where you pick your two guys. Like, these are our two best players. They're both going to get maxed. Then we're going to fill it out with some $10 to $15 million a year guys. All of a sudden we're at this luxury tax threshold. Then we've got just minimum contract guys. And I don't know if that's the healthiest thing for the league, because for example, if you're a team like Oklahoma City that's done a good job of building a roster, plenty of young talent, you've got to start picking guys. Like, at this point, you've got SGA, you got Jalen Williams, you got Josh Giddey. We'll see what Chet's going to be, some of the other guys on the roster. You kind of got to pick 2, maybe 3 of those guys to be the core of your team and let go of the rest simply because of how the luxury tax threshold is going to work. And that doesn't really feel all that fair to teams that, like Oklahoma City, that have done a good job of building their team. And then at this point, you have too much talent. You have to spread around everyone else. That's never really how sports have worked. It's never really how the NBA has worked in general. You're allowed to build super teams. You're allowed to put teams together if you're doing a good job and you have the picks and the assets. You want to go all in and do that. But now you're not only punishing those teams in terms of, you did a good job drafting all these really good players. Well, now you've got to pick 2 of them, even though you might have 5 really good players that work well together. You want guys that stick together. No, we have to spread players around the teams. But it also hurts the players because they're making less money, as I mentioned earlier. To me, this is a very slippery slope by the NBA in terms of roster construction, because one of the things that I think people are starting to enjoy more and more about the league is, yes, people love free agency. They love player movement. However, teams that stick together a little bit, I think, are becoming a little bit more interesting. For example, this year's Denver Nuggets team, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Nikola Jokic. Yes, they brought in guys like Aaron Gordon, some other guys around the edges, but the coach and the main 3 guys have been there for a couple of seasons, and they were allowed to grow and develop. In this new structure, once you have Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic, they probably would not have brought back Michael Porter Jr., despite the fact that he signed this big max contract. He probably would have done that elsewhere. Maybe they would have been forced to trade him specifically because of these new salary cap rules. And I don't think that further pushing away from this, having teams grow and build together, at least a few teams around the league, further pushing that away, especially teams who are doing a good job of building their team like Denver, I don't think that's a healthy thing for the league at all. Now, we'll have to wait and see how exactly these new rules do affect the NBA eventually, but I think this could be a pretty significant issue.